In part 5 of the B introduction, Kant is going to tell us that we can find synthetic a priori cognitions in really all of the sciences. Right? Synthetic a priori judgments are contained as principles in all theoretical sciences of reason. Sciences of reason are those sciences that are not empirical. Right? I mean, of course, as soon as we are interested in empirical knowledge, then we won't have a priori but a posteriori judgments. But insofar as we are doing something purely theoretical or speculative, as Kant might also call it, insofar as we are like within the realm of reason itself, we are supposed to be finding synthetic a priori knowledge that doesn't require experience, but that does extend our knowledge. And so in this section 5, Kant is going to go through 3 different kinds of sciences, or purported sciences in the case of metaphysics, and he's going to tell us, or argue at some length in the first case, that a priori, synthetic a priori judgments are contained in it. And so the first example is mathematics, the second example is natural science, and the third example, the problematic one, is metaphysics. So let's look at mathematics first. Kant makes here the claim that mathematical judgments are all synthetic. And he maybe doesn't mean that like precisely literally, because in mathematics we can have analytic judgments like 3 is 3 maybe, or all triangles are triangles, but those aren't really the interesting ones, right? Those are not really the ones that mathematicians set out to prove, so in a sense they're not really the mathematical propositions. So Kant is going to argue that mathematical propositions, well, everybody believes that those are a priori, that we don't need to do empirical research to find out that 2 plus 2 is 4, like do some experiments, find out by putting 2 things together to 2 other things that, wow, it's 4 and 4 again, but you know, who knows what the next experiment will show us? Everyone believes that mathematics is a priori. Now Kant wants to claim that it is synthetic a priori, and that is the controversial thesis. So let us see what Kant says about it. Well, here is what Kant says about it. I'm going to read through his example of 5 plus 7 is 12. So I first take the number 7, and as I take the fingers of my hand as an intuition for assistance with the concept of 5, to that image of mine I now add the units that I have previously taken together in order to constitute the number 5, one after another, to the number 7, and thus see the number 12 arise. That 7 should be added to 5, I have, to be sure, thought in the concept of the sum is 7 plus 5. But not that this sum is equal to the number 12. The arithmetical proposition is therefore always synthetic. One becomes all the more distinctly aware of that if one takes somewhat larger numbers, for it is then clear that twist and turn our concepts as we will, without getting help from our intuition, we could never find the sum by means of the mere analysis of our concepts. Okay, what is Kant doing? Kant is claiming that when I say that 5 plus 7 is 12, this can't be an analytic judgment. It can't be an analytic judgment because the concept of 12 is in no way contained in the concepts of 5 and 7 and plus and is. Right? So 5 plus 7, well, is maybe not really a concept here. 5 plus 7, I think the number 5, I think the number 7, and as Kant points out, I think that I should add the one to the other. That's what the plus is doing. But by just looking at the meaning of those concepts, Kant tells us, I am never going to discover the concept of 12. It's not in there. In order to get from 5 and 7 to 12, I have to use what Kant calls my intuition, right? Anschauung in German. And my intuition, which we are going to learn soon enough, is Kant's name for, well, at least in the case of human beings, it is going to be Kant's name for sensation, or that which makes sensation possible, maybe. So in fact, in mathematics, Kant is going to tell us we use pure intuition, and pure intuition is sort of the form of our sensation, which is going to turn out to be space and time. So maybe when I do 5 plus 7, maybe I am sort of semi-visualizing 5 and 7 spatial regions, and sort of then visualizing them together and getting to the number of 12. Or maybe it is my conception of counting in time, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Like it is these, it is my grasp of counting as a process in time that allows me to move from the concept of 5 and the concept of 7 to this further concept, which is the concept of 12. Okay, that at least is the story that Kant is telling us. And maybe this can be made, I think, a little bit more clear, this claim that mathematical statements are synthetic statements, if we look at Kant's example from geometry. Right? So his example of a geometrical statement is the following: that the straight line between 2 points is the shortest. Right? If I have 2 points, a point here and a point there, if I draw a straight line from one to the other, then that is also immediately the shortest line between those points. Right? Any non-straight line is going to be longer than the straight line. So the straight line is the shortest line. Is that an analytic statement? Right? Can I see this from the meaning of the concepts alone? Well, Kant says no. My concept of the straight contains nothing of quantity, but only a quality. It is not about more or less. To be straight is just to have no curves, right? It is a qualitative concept. Whereas shortest is a quantitative concept, right? You have to measure, you have to count, and the shortest is the one that leads to the lowest measurement. Seems to be a very different concept, right? Short and straight seem to be two very, very different concepts. So it's hard to see how the claim that the straight line is the shortest could be analytic, right? How it could come from the meaning of those terms alone. It seems to extend our knowledge. That at least is what Kant is saying. And so Kant concludes here that mathematical statements, both those of arithmetic and those of geometry, are synthetic statements. I am moving beyond the concepts that are in the first part of the claim when I make the second part of the claim. I'm adding to my knowledge. I'm generating new knowledge that is not just about the relation of the concepts to each other. And I do this through my grasp of this pure intuition of space and time. Kant doesn't talk about space and time here, but we're going to learn that part of the story soon enough. Okay. Well, I think it is fair to tell you that, like contemporary philosophers right now, generally do not agree with Kant on the claim that mathematical statements are synthetic. So most philosophers nowadays would say that mathematical statements are in fact analytic. Why? Well, we can't really go into the philosophy of mathematics in any detail and talk about all the changes, all the new ideas that were generated about mathematics and in the philosophy of mathematics in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, which completely changed the way that people thought about mathematics, its own internal status, but also its relation to the empirical world. We can't go into all of that, but we can give sort of a very brief impression of what happened. So really what happens, I think, at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century is that people get the idea that mathematical systems aren't really supposed to be true. It is not the case that there are the axioms of geometry, for instance, like the basic truths of geometry, and those are true. And we have to find the true axioms, and then we can derive truths about geometry. Rather, what seems to be the case is that we can come up with many different axiom systems which describe different mathematical geometrical systems. We can have Euclidean geometry, but we can also have non-Euclidean geometries, many different non-Euclidean geometries maybe. And the same holds true, for instance, for the numbers. We can axiomatize the numbers in one way, or we can axiomatize it in another way. And we can make axiom systems about, mathematical entities that Kant had never heard of, like sets, for instance, or classes. So we can do a lot of mathematics by constructing axiom systems. And questions about truth in mathematics are not so much about, are these axioms true, and then what other truths follow from them, but it's more like, well, given these axioms, what can I derive? Right? And if that's the way you think about it, then all mathematical truths are going to be of the form, this statement is true in this axiom system, or this statement is true given this and this set of axioms. And those relations of derivability, really, if you start with these axioms, then you can get to this claim. Those things turn out to be pretty formalizable. You can just show how it works as a sort of formal logical system. And it makes a lot of sense to understand that as a purely analytic procedure. Right? The axioms define the meanings of the terms, and then from the meanings of the terms, using these axioms, using the rules of logic, we can derive all the other truths that exist within this axiom system. So, for instance, if we think about like a standard way of talking about the numbers, and instead of taking Kant's 5 plus 7 is 12, let us maybe take 1 plus 2 is 3. A standard way of axiomatizing, of making a mathematical system about the numbers, says, well, we start with 0 as a number, and then we say that every number has a successor. And so we define 1 as the successor of 0, and 2 as the successor of the successor of 0, and 3 as the successor of the successor of the successor of 0, right? 3 times the successor of 0 is 1, the successor of that is 2, and the successor of that is 3. And then we define plus, right? We define plus. We give the meaning of plus in terms of an operation that has to do with this successor relation, right? We say something like A plus the successor of B is the successor of A plus B. That is sort of one of the axioms that rule the plus symbol, that give the meaning of the plus symbol. And if that's the way you think about it, then 1 plus 2 is 3. The successor of 0 plus the successor of the successor of 0 is the successor of the successor of the successor of 0. It does make a lot of sense to think of that as something that follows just from this defined meaning of those mathematical terms like plus and 0 and successor alone. And so it makes a lot of sense to think about these as purely analytic truths. So those would be the purely analytic truths. Now, it is also the case, of course, that we use mathematics in the world. For instance, we use geometry in order to measure things, in order to do physics all the time, really, right? Physics is all about distances and angles and stuff like that. So if mathematics is just like a defined axiom system, something that we can think up any way we like, how can it apply to the world? Well, there, most contemporary thinkers about mathematics would say that that is actually an empirical question, right? There are all these geometries that mathematicians can make up. Does one of them apply to the real world? Okay, let's do the measurements, right? Let's find out. That is an empirical question, whether any of these geometrical models that we can make and find in mathematics apply out there. And so according to this way of thinking, there would be only the analytic truths and the empirical truths, the a posteriori truths, the analytic truths that are internal to mathematics, and the empirical truths that are about applying mathematics to the world. And so there is no room for anything like a Kantian synthetic a priori in mathematics. Okay, that was very quick, very brief. There are many other positions in contemporary philosophy of mathematics, but this will have to do for our purposes. And so I think the question is, okay, what now, right? We as readers of the Critique of Pure Reason, what should we do with this knowledge? Well, I think one thing we can sort of safely say is that maybe we ought to be a little bit worried. if it were the case that Kant's project depends on his claims about mathematics, depends on his claim that mathematical truths are synthetic a priori. And a lot of defenders of Kant in contemporary literature, including, for instance, Gardner, I don't have it right here, but Gardner in his introduction to the Critique, spent some time arguing that it doesn't. Right? For instance, here in the introduction, section 5, Kant uses mathematics as a sort of example. Look, there are synthetic a priori truths here. That's pretty suggestive, right? That's going to help us in growing into the belief that metaphysics too consists of synthetic a priori truths. But it's not really a fundamental element of Kant's argument, right? Even if Kant is wrong about mathematics, a lot of contemporary Kantians would say, and I would tend to agree with them, even if Kant is wrong about mathematics being synthetic a priori, that doesn't really impact the main story of the Critique, right? There are certain points where we have to say, oh yeah, that maybe doesn't work, or oh, that's not as strong an argument as Kant thought it was, but there's always another argument. It's never like the central thing, never the most important thing on which Kant's story is built. So I think that take is true, and so this would like lead us to a kind of careful reading of the Critique, where we sort of bracket these claims about mathematics and try to find ways around them. And in general, that would be, I think, the right way to proceed. I do want to add to that something more, though, and the something more that I want to add is that maybe Kant's position is not like totally hopeless, right? Because the picture that we have just given of there being, on the one hand, just the analytic internal truths of mathematics, and there being, on the other hand, this sort of empirical question of whether a mathematical theory applies to the world, well, that is not without problems of its own, right? If somebody tells me that 1 plus 2 is 3 within the axiom system of Peano arithmetic, for instance, like one of these axiom systems of mathematics, well, that's okay. But in addition, I'm tempted to say that 1 plus 2 is 3, right? Not just like internally in some mathematical system. 1 plus 2 just is 3, right? I have this conception of 1 and 2 and plus that really sort of predates any mathematical axiom system. And if some mathematician comes to me with an axiom system and says, hey, I've axiomatized the numbers, then I would take the axiom system and see whether it fits my preconception of the numbers, right? Rather than the other way around. What's more, if somebody says, well, 1 plus 2 is 3 within Peano arithmetic, but whether this applies to the world, well, you know, that's an empirical question. Well, it doesn't really seem to be an empirical question whether 1 plus 2 is 3 applies to the world, right? If there's 1 car and 2 more cars, then there are 3 cars. That seems to be an a priori truth about the world, not an empirical truth about the world. And so how is that possible, right? How is it possible that it does seem to be something that I know in advance about the world of experience, how to count in it, right? How to calculate in it? Well, I'm not going to try to answer those questions here, but I just want to put them on the table in order to suggest that maybe the Kantian position, the claim that there's something synthetic a priori going on here, is not totally hopeless. Now, in order to defend it, you would have to say more and different things from what Kant is saying, because you would have to take account of all these new ideas about mathematics, all these new insights into mathematics that have become current since Kant's time. Okay, I'm gonna leave it here for now. Maybe we'll return to mathematics at some later point, if that turns out to be useful. So, that is Kant's first example, mathematics. He is much more brief about the second example, natural science. This might be even more surprising to us, right? Natural science, physica, physics. How is that supposed to contain within itself synthetic a priori judgments as principles? I will adduce only a couple of propositions as examples, such as the proposition that in all alterations of the corporeal world, the quantity of matter remains unaltered, or that in all communication of motion, effect and counter-effect must always be equal. So this sounds at least a bit like what we would get in a mechanics class, right? The first thing sounds a lot like conservation of matter, and the second sounds a lot like Newton's third law, that action is reaction, or action is minus reaction. And we might wonder why Kant would think that those are a priori. Why does he think that those are a priori rather than empirical? Right? Isn't it something that we find out in doing science, that action equals reaction, or that the quantity of matter is always conserved? Well, maybe. In order to really answer that question, in order to really understand what Kant is up to here, we would have to start reading a different book. Not the Critique of Pure Reason, but it's anthologized in Kant's theoretical philosophy after 1781, Kant's Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. That is where he sort of tries to work this out. He tries to work out some very general a priori truths based on matter, really, that sort of form the foundation of physics as he conceives of it. And here, indeed, we find, for instance, these propositions that Proposition 1 in the third chapter, the Metaphysical Foundations of Mechanics, that the quantity of matter in comparison with every other matter can be estimated only by the quantity of motion at a given speed. Okay. Proposition 2, the first law of mechanics. In all changes of corporeal nature, the total quantity of matter remains the same, neither increased nor diminished. Proposition 3, the second law of mechanics. Every change in matter has an external cause. That is, every body persists in its states of rest or motion in the same direction and with the same speed if it is not compelled by an external cause to leave this state. And Proposition 4, the third mechanical law. In all communication of motion, action and reaction are always equal to one another. Now, in this text, Kant is actually going to give proofs, or what he hopes to be proofs of these statements. And they are going to be based very, very closely on some of the slightly different metaphysical truths that we are going to find in the analogies of experience of the Critique of Pure Reason. So in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant is going to defend the idea that there is such a thing as substance that can either that cannot be created or disappear. Right? There has to be something eternal, which we call substance, which always remains. And in the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, Kant is going to claim that in the sort of things that we're doing in natural science, we have to identify that substance with matter, and so we can say that the quantity of matter remains the same. He is going to use his law of causation, his metaphysical law of causation, that every event or every alteration needs a cause, to argue for this second law of mechanics, that every change in matter has an external cause. So let me just read a little bit of that. From general metaphysics, we take as basis the proposition that every change has a cause. And here it is only to be proved of matter that its change must always have an external cause. Matter, as mere object of the outer senses, has no other determinations except those of external relations in space, and therefore undergoes no change except by motion. With respect to the latter, as change of one motion into another, or of a motion into rest, or conversely, a cause must be found by the principle of metaphysics. But this cause cannot be internal, for matter has no essentially internal determinations or grounds of determination. Hence, every change in a matter is based on external causes. And that's the end of that. Now, I don't want to go deeply into that at all. I mean, this is a different book by Kant. It's not the book that we are studying right now. But what we can see is this. Kant gets these truths of pure physics, of pure natural science, which are only, I should add, some really basic fundamental statements. It's not that Kant thinks that we can get the law of gravity really out of this or something like that. Some very basic fundamental statements. He is going to get them from truths that he finds in general metaphysics. That is, truths that he finds in the Critique of Pure Reason itself. And then he is going to think through the concept of matter and think through how these basic metaphysical truths apply to matter. And that's where he comes up with the truths about natural science. So it is really, this is absolutely not apparent from what he says here, but really these fundamental truths of natural science are going to turn out to be the fundamental truths of metaphysics as applied to matter. And so I guess, again, here, what we see is that we can't really use this as an argument, I would say, for the existence of synthetic a priori truths in metaphysics. It is more that Kant thinks that this is suggestive. He suggests, look, I mean, there are these truths in physical science, and maybe you already believe that they are a priori. And I don't think most of us believe that. Like, it's not a very natural thought to us, but maybe it was to some of Kant's contemporaries. And he says, oh, look, then you already believe in synthetic a priori truths. That's nice. But it's not going to play a role in the argument here, right? He is going to have to establish independently that there are synthetic a priori truths in metaphysics. And indeed, that is what the first half of the book is going to be about. So, that brings us at last to metaphysics, where Kant says, well, you know, at the very least, we want synthetic a priori truths there. Whether we have them, okay, that's maybe an open question. All right, so at this point in the introduction in section 6, Kant is going to say, well, the real problem of pure reason is now contained in the question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? And we are going to find the answer to that pretty soon, really, when Kant comes to the transcendental aesthetic and talks about pure intuition. And then again, when we come to the transcendental logic and Kant tells us how there can be a priori concepts and a priori truths involving those concepts. It's maybe not like the most accurate way of describing Kant's project to say that the entire Critique of Pure Reason is an attempt to answer this question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Because a lot of what he's going to do is he's going to establish what are the a priori truths. And he's going to spend a lot of time telling us where we go wrong when we try to think a priori. But, you know, at least this is one of the things that he's going to do, and it's pretty fundamental. So, what we want to do, Kant tells us, is we want to show that metaphysics is possible as a science by showing how metaphysical synthetic a priori truths are possible. Okay, in the rest of the introduction, there's just a few things that I want to point out, and then we will end this video. So the first thing that I want to point out is in section 7, at A12, B25. Here's what Kant does. He gives a definition of the word transcendental. That is nice. That's an important word for Kant. I call all cognition transcendental that is occupied not so much with objects, but rather with our mode of cognition of objects, insofar as this is to be possible a priori. A system of such concepts would be called transcendental philosophy. So the word transcendental for Kant means having to do with our modes of cognition, our a priori modes of cognition of objects. When I'm doing transcendental philosophy, I am thinking about how we can have knowledge of objects a priori, right? So transcendental philosophy is not about a special kind of object, like a transcendental object or something like that. Absolutely not. It's about how we have knowledge of objects, how we think. It is a reflection on our epistemic makeup or our relation to the world, maybe. It's a reflection on knowledge. And transcendental idealism, therefore, must be an idealism that has something to do with our reflection on knowledge, on our ability to know objects. This means that transcendental is a very, very different word from transcendent. and we can't stress this enough. Transcendental is very different from transcendent. Transcendent for Kant means beyond the bounds of experience. So transcendent knowledge would be knowledge beyond the bounds of experience, like knowledge of God maybe. And a transcendent philosophy might be a philosophy that goes beyond the bounds of experience and gives us all kinds of truths about God and eternity and who knows what. And Kant thinks that this is impossible, right? His transcendental philosophy, one of the conclusions is precisely going to be that we should not strive for transcendent cognition because that's not possible. Kant isn't always careful in keeping these terms distinct, transcendental and transcendent, but I think we should be careful to keep them distinct. Second thing I want to point out, it's just a brief remark at A15, B29, where Kant tells us that transcendental philosophy is a philosophy of pure, merely speculative reason. For everything practical, insofar as it contains incentives, is related to feelings which belong among empirical sources of cognition. So, I think Kant is... So basically what Kant is telling us here is that in the Critique of Pure Reason, he's not going to talk about ethics. Right? He's not going to talk about action. He's not going to talk about what is good or bad to do. He's going to say a little bit about it, actually, but like that's not the main thing. We're thinking about theoretical knowledge here. Whether that is good or bad, I mean, is it... You could think that Kant is making a mistake here, right? And if you are at all into the idea that all knowledge is embodied knowledge, or that we can only understand ourselves as actors in the world, as we will find, for instance, in 20th century thinkers, ranging from Heidegger to contemporary neurophilosophers, then you're going to think that Kant is making a mistake here. Personally, I think that Kant is probably making a mistake here. But okay, he thinks that he can keep action out of the Critique of Pure Reason. And so finally, the last thing I want to read out, but it's something that we will talk about a lot more when we get to the transcendental aesthetic next, is this. There are, and now I'm at the very end of the introduction, there are two stems of human cognition, which may perhaps arise from a common but to us unknown root, namely sensibility and understanding, through the first of which objects are given to us, but through the second of which they are thought. Now, if sensibility were to contain a priori representations, which constitute the condition under which objects are given to us, it will belong to transcendental philosophy. The transcendental doctrine of the senses will have to belong to the first part of the science of elements, since the conditions under which alone the objects of human cognition are given precede those under which those objects are thought. What Kant is doing here is he's first introducing his incredibly important claim that we must make a distinction between sensibility and understanding as the two stems of human cognition. And Kant is going to tell us that they always have to work together if like any real knowledge is to be possible. But he's going to talk about one of them first. He's going to talk about sensibility first, that through which objects are given to us. And that is going to be what he's going to do in the transcendental aesthetic. And then afterwards we're going to talk about thought, and that is going to happen in the transcendental logic, which will turn out to be a lot longer. So here he's giving us the plan for the next parts of the work. And what he really means by all of this is something we will see when we get there.